ready for the most shockingly effective, yet utterly unappealing, food preservation hacks from history. If you think your fridge is essential, wait until you hear how medieval folks kept food edible for months, sometimes years, using techniques that will make you glad you live in 2025. Prepare to be amazed by the sheer ingenuity born of necessity. Before you get comfy, go ahead and like the video and subscribe, only if you're actually enjoying it. Tell me in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is for you. I'm always curious to see the mix of places and time zones hanging out here together. Close your eyes for a moment and imagine the hum of the modern world fading away. No buzzing refrigerators in the corner of the kitchen. No supermarkets lined with endless shelves of plastic-wrapped produce. No trucks carrying food across continents. No faint glow of an electric stove waiting at the turn of a dial. Imagine instead that you are standing in a world thousands of years ago, a world where survival clung to the earth itself, where every meal depended on what you could grow, catch, store, or trade, and where food was never a guarantee, but a question that lived in the pit of every stomach. This is where our story begins, not in the halls of kings or the noise of battles, but in the kitchens of ordinary people, though even calling them kitchens feels misleading. They were not tidy rooms with cupboards and countertops, but smoky corners of huts, mud brick storerooms lined with clay jars, caves dug into hillsides, and fires built beneath open skies. Here, people fought their own war, a quiet war, not against enemies with weapons, but against rot, against mold, against hunger itself. The truth of ancient life was fragility. Nature gave and nature took, and there was no way to predict which it would be. In spring and summer there might be plenty, fields golden with grain, orchards bending under fruit, rivers spilling with fish. But winter crept closer with every shortening day, and famine hovered in the imagination like a shadow. A single poor harvest could mean misery. Locusts could wipe out entire fields in hours. Drought could turn fertile soil into dust. A family could work tirelessly all year, only to discover their storehouses too light to carry them through the cold. Every meal was a calculation. Every grain mattered, and so people became inventive, endlessly so, finding ways to stretch what little they had, to protect it from time, and to make it last beyond its natural limits. These quiet hacks of food preservation might sound humble to us now, but they were the difference between life and death. It is difficult for us, cushioned by the abundance of modern supply chains, to truly feel the grip of hunger that haunted ancient lives. Today, hunger is often a momentary discomfort solved by opening a cupboard or ordering a meal. In the past, hunger was a constant companion, a lurking fear that shaped culture, belief, and even the rhythm of festivals. Entire religions placed offerings before gods in thanks for food, and entire mythologies explained the cycles of famine and feast through the whims of divine beings. People prayed not for riches, not for power, but for fertile fields, for rains to fall in their season, for animals to reproduce, for granaries to stay full. To be fed was the greatest blessing. To face hunger was the most common curse, and the clever tricks that emerged to fight it were treasured like sacred knowledge, passed down through families, whispered to neighbors, repeated until they were as ingrained as language itself. Imagine an evening in a small Mesopotamian village, the sun sinking behind the horizon, the cool of night settling over mud brick homes. Inside one such home, a family gathers around a small lamp, the flicker of flame illuminating shelves lined with clay jars. A father stoops to check them, running his hands along their sealed lids. These jars are more precious than treasure chests. Inside is life, barley dried and stored from the last harvest, dates pressed into dense cakes, salted fish caught in the river. He counts them silently, measuring with his eyes whether there is enough to last until the next harvest. His children nibble bread dipped in sweet syrup, their mouths sticky with sugar, oblivious to his calculation. For them the meal is simple comfort. For him it is arithmetic with the weight of survival. If rats gnaw through one of these jars, if moisture seeps in, if mold begins to spread, if thieves come at night, the entire family could starve. That is what food meant, not pleasure or luxury, but protection against death. The irony is that many of the methods discovered to preserve food were accidents, born not from intention but from mistake and curiosity. Somewhere in the past a piece of fish was hung too close to a fire and forgotten. Days later, someone, perhaps too hungry to be picky, tore off a bite and found it edible, even tasty, and still nourishing. Smoke, it turned out, was not just a cooking tool but a preserver, drying the flesh and protecting it from rot. Another time, a pot of grain was buried in the ground, perhaps as a hiding place during conflict, or as a desperate attempt to store it away from pests. Months later, it was unearthed, and the grain was still good, saved by the cool darkness of the earth. Honey, too, must have been a revelation. Left in jars, it simply never spoiled. Even after years, even after decades, its sweetness remained. Archaeologists have uncovered pots of honey from tombs in Egypt, thousands of years old, still golden, still edible, still smelling faintly of flowers that bloomed when pharaohs ruled. Each of these discoveries was not just a curiosity but a breakthrough. They were woven into the survival strategies of entire civilizations. Picture the first person who tasted fermented milk. They must have wrinkled their nose at the sour tang, perhaps hesitated before drinking, but hunger overcame caution. To their surprise, it was not poison. It was rich, easier to digest, and strangely satisfying. That accident became yogurt, cheese, kefir, ghee, butter. Whole cuisines blossomed from the simple fact that milk, fragile and quick to spoil, could be given new life with time, heat, or bacteria. Think too of the first person who ate bread long past its freshness, rock hard and unappetizing, only to soak it in broth and realize it still gave strength. That trick, repeated again and again, became hardtack, flatbread, dried loaves food that armies marched on and sailors carried across oceans. Survival was not always pleasant, but it was effective. These early kitchens were places of smoke and clay, of salt and sun. They smelled of fermenting cabbage, of drying herbs, of vinegar-soaked vegetables, of meat hanging in rafters. They looked less like spaces of comfort and more like laboratories of necessity. Every shelf and every pot a silent experiment in fighting time. Children grew up surrounded by the sounds of their mothers pounding grain into flour, of fathers salting fish by the riverbank, of grandparents instructing them never to leave jars uncovered, never to waste oil, never to forget which foods could last and which would vanish quickly. These lessons were survival manuals disguised as chores. To a child, it might have seemed tedious. To an adult, it was the barrier that stood between their family and famine. When we think of history, we often imagine battles, rulers, empires, inventions, but the truth is that much of history was written, not in palaces or on battlefields, but in kitchens, in smoky huts, in storerooms, where jars of grain sat sealed in silence. Civilization itself depended on people mastering the art of food preservation. Cities could not exist if food spoiled too quickly. Armies could not march without supplies that lasted. Trade routes would not have flourished without salted fish, dried fruit, and jars of oil moving across continents. Every preserved meal was a step toward building societies, larger and more stable than the fragile clusters of nomads who roamed before. In this way, food hacks were not trivial details. They were foundations of civilization. As you sit with this thought, imagine again that you are in one of those ancient villages. The air smells of earth and smoke. Somewhere nearby a baby cry. Outside, the fields lie quiet under the moon. Inside, a family finishes their meager supper, and the parents exchange a look, one part pride, one part worry. They have food tonight, yes, but will they have enough for tomorrow, for the week after, for the long winter ahead? And then, they glance at the jars, at the salted meat, at the honey, at the dried herbs hanging above the fire. These are their weapons, their tools, their small miracles. And in those jars and bundles hangs the thin but unbroken thread of survival that stretches all the way from their world to ours. Imagine the curl of smoke rising into the air, a slow ribbon twisting above a small fire, its scent clinging to everything it touches, filling the space with a sharp yet strangely comforting smell. In the ancient world, smoke was more than a sign of cooking or warmth. It was one of the first great discoveries of survival. A simple but brilliant answer to the constant battle with time. Meat and fish, fresh from the hunt or the river, spoiled quickly, flies gathered, bacteria spread, and within days the flesh turned dangerous. A successful hunt could become a tragedy if the food could not be kept. But then someone, perhaps by accident, left meat too close to a low fire, and instead of rotting it, dried and hardened, shrinking but holding its essence. The smoke had changed it. Days passed, then weeks, and the meat was still edible, still nourishing, its flavor sharp, salty, and infused with the smell of fire. That small discovery rippled across continents, becoming one of humanity's oldest and most reliable tricks. Picture a community thousands of years ago, hunters returning with a deer or fishermen dragging nets heavy with their catch. At first there is feasting. The family eats until full. Neighbors gather to share. Bellies are satisfied. But then the problem lingers: what to do with what remains. Waste is not an option, because food is life. Slowly, the hunters learn to hang strips of flesh above a slow fire, letting the smoke drift upward, curling round the meat day and night. Children run in and out of the hut, their noses filled with the rich scent, their eyes following the twisting grey tendrils. Days later, when hunger gnaws again, the meat is still there, tougher and darker but safe, waiting. The family eats and learns something valuable. Smoke is not just heat, not just fuel, but a guardian against decay. From that moment, smokehouses appeared in different forms across the world. In Iron Age villages, huts were built not for living, but for hanging food over fires, where smoke was carefully guided to saturate every piece. Among Viking communities, the long winters demanded preparation. Fish pulled from the northern seas were salted and smoked until they became almost indestructible, packed into bundles that could last for months. For sailors who braved the waves in open ships, smoked fish was a treasure. It gave strength when storms raged and land was far away. In the forests of North America, tribes hung strips of buffalo or deer over slow-burning fires, drying them into jerky that could be carried on long hunts. The trick was universal because it was simple and because it worked. Wherever there was fire, there was smoke, and wherever there was smoke, there was survival. The beauty of smoke is that it worked on more than one level. It dried the meat, pulling out the moisture that bacteria craved, but it also added a layer of chemical protection, natural preservatives that slowed the growth of mold and decay. The ancients did not know the science, but they knew the result. They knew that food lasted longer, that bellies were filled more securely, that the threat of hunger was pushed further away. Over generations, the smoky taste became more than necessity. It became a flavor that carried comfort. To bite into smoked meat was to taste not just nourishment but safety, to know that someone had thought ahead, that tomorrow would not be empty. If you lean in closer to these ancient scenes, you can almost feel the atmosphere. The air thick with smoke, staining walls black, clinging to hair and clothing. The fire crackling softly in the corner, never left to die out. Because it was not just a cooking flame, but a preservation tool. Children might complain of watery eyes, but the smell itself became the background of life. Imagine a winter night in a Viking longhouse, the wind howling outside, snow piling against the walls. Inside, smoke curls along the rafters, and above the fire hang rows of fish, their silvery skins turned dark with time. A family sits below, chewing on strips of that same fish, thankful for its salty toughness. It is not fine dining, but it is survival, and in its own way it is comforting. In other corners of the world, smoke became tied to ritual. In some cultures, the act of smoking food was accompanied by chants or prayers, a recognition that something so powerful, something that held hunger at bay, must be touched by the divine. Fires themselves were sacred, and the smoke that rose to the sky was seen as a bridge between earth and the heavens. Preserving food was not just practical but spiritual, a way of connecting the struggle of daily life with the unseen forces that people believed controlled their fate. The ordinary act of hanging meat over fire became, in its own quiet way, an offering of gratitude. Think about how important this was in times of travel. Long journeys by foot, horseback, or ship were unthinkable without food that could last. A caravan crossing deserts could not carry fresh meat, it would rot in days. But strips of smoked goat or lamb, though hard and chewy, could fuel the march across endless sand. An army on campaign could not rely only on local harvests. They carried barrels of smoked pork or beef to keep men fed. Smoked foods were the rations of empire, the hidden force that made exploration and conquest possible. When Roman legions marched, when traders traveled along the Silk Road, when sailors ventured into unknown seas, smoke traveled with them, clinging to their supplies, keeping hunger at bay. Yet beyond armies and traders, there was the intimacy of family life. Imagine a mother in a small village, hanging fish caught by her children above a fire. She knows the winter will be hard, that snow will cut them off from hunting and rivers. Every strip of fish is a promise to her children that they will eat when the world outside is barren. For her, the smoke is not a flavor but a lullaby. a way of quieting the fear that comes with every approaching winter. In that sense, smoke was love, an invisible hand stretching from one season to the next, holding hunger away. Even today, when smoking food has become a culinary art, when people savor the rich taste of smoked salmon or barbecue, the roots of that flavor go back to necessity. What we enjoy as luxury began as desperation. The strong scent that clings to smoked meat is the scent of survival, the echo of ancestors who discovered that fire could feed them twice, once in cooking and again in preserving. When you eat something smoky today, you are tasting a history older than writing, older than cities, a history written in the simple curl of gray rising from burning wood. The beauty of this ancient trick is its simplicity. Fire was always there, a companion since the dawn of humanity. To sit by it, to cook with it, to warm hands by it, was already second nature. To realize it could also protect food was like discovering that a trusted friend had yet another gift to give. No tools were needed beyond wood, patience, and time. No expensive materials, no secret ingredients, just the smoke itself. It was democratic, available to any family with the will to try. That is why it spread so widely, appearing in cultures that never met, from the icy north to the steaming tropics. Everywhere that people lit fires, smoke became their quiet ally. And so, in the forgotten kitchens of the past, smoke curled endlessly, day and night. It hung in the rafters, it seeped into walls, it clung to skin, and it flavored life. To us it might feel heavy or unpleasant, but to them it was comfort, reassurance, and survival. It whispered that tomorrow there would be food, that the hunt was not wasted, that the catch was not lost. It carried them through winters, through journeys, through wars. It allowed families to grow, communities to thrive, and civilizations to take root. The simple ribbon of smoke, rising gently from an ancient fire, was one of the first invisible shields between humanity and the hunger that stalked us always. And when you close your eyes and picture it now, curling upward in the half-dark, carrying its sharp but steady scent, you can almost hear the relief in the breaths of those who first discovered its power. When we talk about the story of survival, there is one mineral that runs through the veins of every ancient kitchen, one simple crystal that shaped the fortunes of empires and carried the weight of life itself, and that is salt. It is easy to think of it as just the white dust we sprinkle carelessly on food today, something so ordinary that most of us do not even notice its presence. But for the people of the ancient world, salt was as precious as the sun, and they knew in their bones that without it they would not endure. Imagine yourself walking through a small settlement thousands of years ago, the kind of place where huts leaned together like tired friends, where fields stretched ragged toward the horizon, where families watched the sky with nervous eyes, praying for steady rain. In such a place, food was always a fragile possession. Grains could mold, meat could rot within hours, and fish pulled from the river would spoil before nightfall. But then, there was this strange, glittering substance that had the power to stop time, to hold decay at bay, to turn something fleeting into something lasting. Salt was not simply seasoning, it was preservation, it was survival. And in the hands of ancient cooks and wanderers, it became a kind of quiet magic. Think of the first shepherds who realized that when meat was rubbed with salt and left to dry under the wind, it did not fester or grow sour, but hardened into a tough, salty food that could be eaten weeks later on long journeys. Think of the fishermen along the Mediterranean who packed their catch in layers of salt and opened the jars months later to find the flesh still edible. Think of the farmers who guarded salt as carefully as they guarded their seed grain, because without it their harvest could not last until the next. This was a time when refrigeration was unimaginable, when life danced on the edge of famine each season, so salt became not just a food hack but a lifeline passed through generations. Imagine the taste of salted fish carried along the roads of Rome, or the strips of cured meat gnawed by soldiers, marching across deserts, or the clay jars of salted vegetables, kept in the houses of China, each bite a reminder that salt had given time back to the people. It was so important that it shaped the language of history. The word salary itself comes from the Latin salarium, the allowance given to Roman soldiers so they could buy salt. Entire cities were founded near salt mines. Caravans crossed dangerous deserts just to carry blocks of it. Wars erupted over its control. When you look at a pinch of it today, you are holding something that once meant the difference between plenty and hunger, between sickness and health. And yet, behind this vast importance was a simple truth whispered in every household. that if you wanted your family to survive the long months of scarcity, you salted what you could. You rubbed it into meat. You soaked vegetables in brine. You cured fish until it was as tough as leather. You carried a little pouch of it when traveling because you knew it was more reliable than luck. Salt was not glamorous. It was not worshipped like wine or oil, but it was more enduring than both, and people understood that deeply. Imagine a family in ancient Greece gathering at a low table, passing around bread dipped in olive oil and sprinkled with salt, not as a luxury, but as an affirmation of life itself. Picture caravans on the Silk Road, where salt cakes were traded alongside silken spices. And remember that each small grain was valued as protection against hunger. Even in times of plenty, people salted their food, because they had been taught by centuries of hardship that plenty was always temporary, that famine lurked just beyond the horizon, that only preserved food gave true security. And if you walked into the smoky kitchens of the past, you would see this lesson in every corner. Clay jars filled with brine lined the walls, strings of salted meat hung from beams, fish lay drying on racks dusted with crystals. The air itself carried the sharp tang of it, and children grew up with that smell in their noses, learning that salt was as much a part of life as bread or water. Salt was so tied to existence that it even seeped into religion and ritual. In ancient offerings, people sprinkled salt on sacrifices as a sign of purity, as though the gods too recognized its value. In Japan, salt was scattered to purify spaces, to keep evil away, much as families used it to keep rot away from their food. There is something deeply poetic about that, the way a simple mineral touched not just the body but the spirit, becoming a symbol of endurance. And when you drift back to those times and picture the faces of farmers, shepherds, traders, mothers crouched by the fire, you begin to understand why they guarded it so fiercely. It was not just a taste, but a shield, a silent guardian against the hunger that haunted them all. Think of the ancient traveler walking across a barren road, reaching into his pack to find a piece of salted fish or meat, chewing slowly while the wind howled around him. Each bite was a reminder that salt had preserved his strength, had carried life across miles and months. Think of a mother in a village sealing a jar of vegetables with brine, pressing the lid down tightly, whispering a prayer that the jar would hold through the winter. These were not luxuries. These were the invisible threads that kept families alive. And as you fall deeper into this story, imagine yourself holding a handful of salt, letting the crystals slip through your fingers, knowing that each small grain is tied to centuries of survival. You see, the history of salt is not about empire or trade routes alone. It is about the quiet work of survival done in every kitchen, by people whose names we will never know, who salted their food with care so that their children could eat tomorrow. And in the stillness of night, when you think about the people who lived long before us, you realize that their gratitude for salt was not superstition, but wisdom. They had learned through hunger and loss that nothing was more precious than the power to stop decay, to hold on to life just a little longer. So as you listen and drift toward sleep, carry with you the image of those ancient kitchens glowing with firelight, the air filled with the sharp, steady scent of salt, and know that in those smoky rooms people discovered one of the simplest, most powerful food hacks ever known, one that saved countless lives, one that still lingers in every grain we scatter today. Close your eyes and imagine the sound of rushing water, the kind that never stops moving, slipping between reeds, curling around stones, carrying with it the promise of life, but also the danger of loss. For the people of the ancient world, rivers were both friend and foe. They watered the fields and gave fish to hungry hands, but they also swelled into floods that could ruin months of planting, or dry into trickles that left crops withering in the sun. Villagers grew up beside them because they had to. Without water, nothing lived, but to rely on a river meant constant risk. And so, as with every other corner of ancient survival, human minds learned to study, to listen, to adapt. Out of this watchfulness grew some of the cleverest food hacks of all. Systems so simple in appearance, yet so powerful in effect, that whole civilizations survived because of them. At first, a farmer might notice that after a flood receded, silt lay thick across the field, dark and rich, far better than the dry dirt nearby. He saw how plants grew taller there, how grain came in thicker. This observation became a practice. Instead of fearing the river, he coaxed it, cutting shallow ditches with stone tools, guiding the water where he wanted it to go, trapping the silt, feeding the soil. What began as a scratched line in the earth became over generations an art. Irrigation channels dug deep and lined with reeds, dams built from piled stones, embankments shaped by countless hands. Every handful of water captured meant more food, and more food meant children lived through the winter. You can picture it if you lean into the silence. Men and women, knee-deep in mud sweat, shining on their backs, hauling baskets of earth to raise a levee, singing work songs to pass the hours, knowing that what they built was the difference between famine and feasting. They didn't think of it as engineering, though in truth it was. It was survival wrapped in mud and reeds, and the wisdom of it passed from one generation to the next, as naturally as a lullaby. Children grew up watching their fathers press their palms against the soil, feeling if it was wet enough, and they learned which way the ditches should bend so the water moved but never rushed too fast. This was knowledge etched into memory long before it was ever written. And rivers were not just controlled on land, they were also harvested. Think of the first time someone saw fish trapped in a shrinking pool when the waters fell back, flopping and gasping but alive. That sight sparked a thought. What if we build our own pool? What if we trap them before they escape? Soon woven baskets were lowered into streams. Stone weirs were built to funnel fish into waiting nets. Ponds were dug where captured fish could be kept until needed. This, too, was a hack of survival. Instead of rushing to eat all the fish at once, families learned to store them alive, to stretch the catch across lean days. Water became a larder. The flow of rivers was bent not just for crops, but for animals, for fish, for reeds that could be cut into mats and baskets. Entire economies grew from these quiet manipulations of water, and yet every step was haunted by risk. A storm too strong could break the embankments. A drought too long could turn ditches into dry scars. And so the people prayed, building rituals around their waterworks, offerings tossed into rivers, songs sung to call for rain, myths woven about gods who controlled the floods. In their stories you can hear the fear that lived in them, the knowledge that their survival rested on forces larger than themselves. But you can also hear the pride. When a flood came and their embankments held, when the fields shone green and thick with life, they knew it was because of their hands, their thought, their shared labor. We tend to think of food storage as jars and smokehouses, but for these people, the greatest storage was the river itself, slowed and shaped to feed them, not just for a season, but for lifetimes. If you imagine walking through one of those old valleys, perhaps along the Nile or the Tigris, you would see it in every direction. Ditches cut like veins across the earth ponds where fish swam lazily, children playing at the edges of irrigation pools, women bending to cut reeds for baskets. Life and water tangled together so tightly that one could not exist without the other. These were not the grand canals we marvel at in ruins today, but humble, local works, the kind built with bare feet and stubborn patience. Yet without them there would have been no harvest, no bread, no villages growing into towns. These small water hacks were the quiet miracles of survival. And though we rarely think of them now, they were the reason so many voices of the past were able to live long enough to become ancestors. In every drop guided, in every ditch carved, lay the promise that tomorrow there would still be food on the table, and that promise was more precious than gold. Imagine the first time a family realized that food left too long began to turn sour, but did not always turn deadly. A pot of milk left in the shade might thicken, its sweetness fading into something sharper, something with a bite on the tongue but strangely filling. A jar of vegetables covered with brine might wrinkle and soften, but instead of rotting, it stayed edible, even flavorful in a new way. These small accidents were the beginning of one of the greatest survival secrets of the ancient world, the art of fermentation. Though no one back then had words for bacteria or microbes, they only had the senses that told them when something smelled right or wrong, when it tasted good or bad, and when it filled the belly without making it sick. Out of this trial and error grew a tradition that was both practical and magical, a way to stretch food beyond its natural limits, to turn the fragile into the durable, to save lives when fresh harvests ran dry. Picture a farmer's family in a time when there were no refrigerators, no sealed cans, no chemical preservatives. The wheat had been harvested, the milk collected, the vegetables pulled from the soil, but every day they sat uneaten was a gamble. Milk soured quickly, meat spoiled, and vegetables shriveled. You could smoke some of the meat or dry fruit in the sun, but what of the things that could not be dried? Here, fermentation stepped in. Maybe it began with milk left too long, turning to curds and whey. Someone braver than the rest tasted it, expecting sickness, but instead found nourishment. The curds could be pressed into cheese, lasting far longer than milk. Cheese became a small miracle, portable, storable, shareable. Now milk, which spoiled in hours, could last for weeks, even months, and not just last, but become richer, more sustaining. The same story unfolded with grains. Cooked porridge forgotten for a day or two began to bubble, to fizz, to give off a yeasty smell. Instead of being tossed away, some curious soul tasted it and found it had changed into something intoxicating, something that warmed the chest and eased the mind. Beer was born, and with it not only a way to preserve calories in liquid form, but also a source of safe hydration in a world where water could be foul with unseen dangers. Vegetables, too, found their second life through fermentation. Cabbage pressed with salt, cucumbers stored in brine, olives soaking in their own bitter juices until softened and transformed. Each experiment meant risk, but once the trick was known, it spread like fire across villages and tribes. The brine, the bubbling, the souring, these were not decay but transformation, a harnessing of nature's invisible workers. Without knowing the science, ancient people learned the patterns, the recipes, the conditions. A clay jar sealed with wax, a wooden barrel buried partly in the ground to stay cool. Leaves used to cover and weigh down the vegetables beneath the brine. These hacks were passed down like heirlooms, never written in books but carried in hands and eyes, each family adding its own twist, its own preference for taste and timing. It is easy to imagine the flavor of those early ferments, sharp, sour, earthy, alive on the tongue. They were not just ways of saving food, they became tastes people craved. Meals without a bit of sour cabbage or a sip of fermented drink would feel incomplete. Entire cuisines were built around them, and behind every bite was the deeper truth. Fermentation kept people alive. In harsh winters, when fields lay bare, the barrels of fermented vegetables kept bellies from emptying. In summers, when milk was plentiful, cheese ensured that nourishment extended into the leaner seasons. Fermented drinks offered hydration when clean water could not be trusted, reducing sickness, lowering deaths, even if the people themselves did not know why. But fermentation was more than survival. It carried culture, ritual, and even spirituality. Many societies believed that fermentation was a kind of magic, the way bubbling liquid seemed to breathe, the way it came alive on its own, the way something bland transformed into something complex. All of it seemed like proof that unseen spirits lived within. Gods of beer were worshipped, prayers offered before opening a new jar, songs sung during brewing and fermenting. These were not just hacks, they were holy mysteries, and in a way, they were right. Invisible life was at work, unseen forces that transformed decay into nourishment. The ancients may not have known the word microbe, but they understood the gift. To walk into an ancient household at the time of harvest would be to smell fermentation everywhere. Clay jars lined against a wall, some sealed with cloth, others covered in wax, each one at a different stage of bubbling and souring. Children peeking curiously at the fizz of beer brewing, women pressing curds of cheese into molds, men hauling barrels of cabbage into cool storage pits. The air would hum with scent, sharp, tangy, yeasty, earthy. These were not signs of rot, but of security, the smells of survival. They knew that in the months to come, when snow or drought stripped away the easy abundance, they would have food that endured, and not just food that endured, but food that nourished. Fermentation did more than preserve. It unlocked nutrients, made grains easier to digest, turned milk digestible even for those who struggled with it raw. Without knowing the why, people could feel the difference in their bodies. Think, too, of how fermentation fostered community. Brewing beer was rarely a solitary task. It was a shared ritual, neighbors coming together, helping stir, lifting heavy pots, waiting for the bubbling to begin. The same was true of cheesemaking or preserving vegetables. These tasks wove people together in cooperation, and when the final product was ready, it was rarely hoarded. It was shared in feasts, in rituals, in celebrations of survival itself. Fermented foods became more than hacks of preservation. They became bonds, linking people not just to each other but to their ancestors, who had passed down the knowledge. And yet, like all things of survival, fermentation demanded vigilance. Sometimes the souring went too far. Sometimes mold crept in. Sometimes a jar turned dangerous instead of safe. It was a skill to know the difference, to smell when something had gone wrong, to see when a ferment had failed. Those who mastered this skill became keepers of wisdom, respected for their ability to guide others through the delicate balance of life and rot. They were guardians of the line between nourishment and poison, and their knowledge saved lives. Over centuries, these practices grew more refined. Wooden barrels replaced clay jars in some places. Salt became a key ally, not just for taste but for safety, slowing bad rot and favoring the good ferment. Spices, too, joined the process, both for flavor and preservation. Each addition layered more complexity into the hack, making it not just practical but beautiful. And in the end, this beauty mattered, because food was not only survival but joy. In the sour crunch of pickled vegetables, in the mellow savor of aged cheese, in the warming rush of beer, people found not just calories but comfort. Fermentation then was not an accident once discovered. It was cultivated, cherished, and guarded. Without it, countless ancient communities would not have endured through long winters or long journeys. Without it, trade routes might not have flourished. Cultures might not have shared tastes that traveled across mountains and seas. To this day, when we eat cheese, drink wine, sip beer, bite into pickles, we echo the wisdom of those early hacks. We carry in our mouths the same survival trick that kept their children alive, that fed their villages, that sustained whole civilizations. It is easy to forget that these foods we take for granted began as desperate experiments by people who could not afford waste, who needed every calorie to stretch as far as possible. It is easy to forget that their discovery was not about flavor first, but about survival. But if you close your eyes and imagine the hunger of a winter night in an ancient village, the relief of opening a jar of cabbage, still crisp and sour, the joy of cutting into a wheel of cheese, when milk was long gone, you begin to understand why fermentation was not just clever, it was sacred. And it was one of the greatest food hacks of all time, the one that turned hunger into fullness, danger into safety, uncertainty into continuity. It was the quiet alchemy that saved lives again and again, and its legacy lives on in every bite we take today. Picture yourself standing in a smoky little hut where the air is thick with the scent of wood and meat. A rack hangs above a low fire, strips of fish or slices of venison glistening in the flickering light. Someone bends down, stirs the embers, and a puff of smoke curls upward, wrapping around the food like a protective hand. It is not cooking in the way we know it, sizzling on a pan or bubbling in a pot, but something slower, quieter, meant not for the hunger of today, but for the survival of tomorrow. This was smoking, one of the oldest food hacks humans ever discovered, and it saved lives again and again. Long before refrigerators, long before tins or jars, smoke was the invisible shield against spoilage. It was the guardian that kept rot away, the preservative that bought time, days, and sometimes weeks, so a family could stretch a catch or a kill instead of watching it vanish. If you think of it, this was almost like alchemy, turning fragile flesh that would have spoiled in a day into food that could last through journeys, storms, or lean winters. And what is remarkable is that people discovered it not through textbooks or laboratories, but through the simple act of living close to fire. Imagine one of our ancestors, thousands of years ago, tossing a hunk of meat onto a fire to cook it. The smoke clings to it, perfumes it, and when a piece is left near the smoke for hours, it changes, it dries, darkens, grows chewy, but it also keeps. Someone would have bitten into it days later, half expecting sourness, but instead finding it still edible. That moment would have been a revelation. From then on, fire became not just warmth and light, but a tool for preservation. Think about what it meant for a hunter who had brought down a deer, more meat than his family could eat in one sitting. Without preservation, much of it would be wasted, left to rot, or stolen by scavengers. But with smoke, he could feed his children for days. A fisherman, too, hauling in nets, heavy with catch, could keep some for the future instead of watching it spoil in the sun. In this way, smoking meant security. It meant not being trapped in a cycle of feast and famine. It meant choice. And soon, cultures everywhere were refining the method, each one shaping it to their own environment. In the north, where cold air already slowed rot, smoking was paired with drying strips of salmon hung in the smokehouses of coastal peoples, becoming the rich, oily food that would carry them through long winters. In warmer lands, spices and herbs were sometimes added to the smoke, both to mask stronger odors and to give flavor, turning necessity into delicacy. Some dug pits, letting meat rest above slow-burning coals. Others built huts, the smoke thick inside, food hanging from rafters like a harvest of flesh. The beauty of this hack was its simplicity. Anyone with fire and patience could do it. But it was not only about the smoke itself. It was about the knowledge of how much heat, how much distance, how much time. Too much fire, and the food would burn. Too little smoke, and it would spoil anyway. It took careful watching, the kind of attention that comes from generations living with the same rhythms. Children grew up playing near the smoke, breathing it in, learning its taste, so that by the time they were adults, they knew instinctively when the food was ready. And beyond the huts and pits, there was the wider meaning. Smoke gave people the freedom to travel. Imagine traders setting out on journeys that would take them across deserts or mountains. Without preserved food, they would starve long before their destination. With smoked meat or fish, they could carry supplies for weeks, tucking strips into bags made of hide, chewing them as they walked. Armies, too, marched on smoke. Soldiers carried bundles of smoked rations, and entire campaigns might have collapsed without them. Behind every battle and every expedition, there was someone tending the fires, hanging food in the smoke, ensuring that the march could continue. Yet even in times of peace, smoking carried weight. In villages, it was often a communal act, a gathering of families to preserve the catch of a season. Nets of fish brought in from the river would be divided, smokehouses crowded with silver bodies strung up in rows. The air would be thick with haze, children running in and out, dogs whining at the smell. Days later, bundles of dried fish would be tied up, stored away for winter. The entire rhythm of survival pulsed around those fires. And in this way, smoke became memory. It wove itself into culture. Songs were sung about it, rituals built around it. In some places, the act of smoking food was linked to prayers, an offering to the gods of fire and air, a way of asking for continued abundance. The crackle of the fire, the slow rising smoke, these were not just chores but sacred acts, reminders that survival was always balanced on the edge of chance. Think about the sensory world of those huts, the sting of smoke in the eyes, the constant need to stir the embers so they did not die out, the mingling smells of wood and fat, sometimes almost sweet, sometimes acrid. People lived in that haze for hours, coughing, blinking, but never complaining, because they knew what was at stake. To walk away from the smoke was to risk hunger later, and hunger was never far away. In ancient times, the line between plenty and famine was thin, always shifting. A bad hunt, a failed crop, a storm at sea, and suddenly families were looking at empty bowls. In those moments, it was the bundles of smoked food that saved them, the strips pulled down from rafters, chewed slowly, passed from hand to hand. It is humbling to realize how much of human history has the smell of smoke in it. We tend to think of fire as light and heat, but for thousands of years, it was also a pantry. And though we now have freezers and sealed packaging, smoking still lingers in our kitchens. Not because we need it anymore, but because we still crave its taste. It reminds us of those fires, of those ancient hacks, of the ingenuity that carried our ancestors through countless winters. Every time someone bites into a piece of smoked salmon or jerky, they are tasting survival, tasting the wisdom of people who learned that fire could do more than cook. It could preserve, it could protect, it could save lives. Imagine sitting by the glow of a fire long after the sun has gone down, the air cool and the world hushed, except for the occasional crackle of the flames. In your lap rests a flat stone warmed from the embers, and on it lies the small miracle of the ancient world, bread. Not the fluffy yeasted loaf we imagine today, but something simpler, flatter, more primal. Bread in its earliest forms was nothing more than crushed grain mixed with water and laid on a hot rock until it browned. And yet, even in this humble beginning, there was genius. Grain on its own, whether wheat, barley, or millet, was hard to chew, tough on the teeth, and slow to yield its nourishment. But grind it, add water, and cook it, and suddenly a handful of seeds could feed many. That simple trick transformed human survival, and bread became one of the most powerful food hacks in history. You have to picture the moment when someone first tried it. Perhaps they spilled grain into a clay pot that held a little rainwater. Perhaps they left it in the sun and saw it soften. Perhaps they pressed it into a paste and dropped a lump on a hot stone. The smell alone would have been a revelation, a nutty, toasty aroma rising into the air, drawing curious eyes. Then came the taste, rich and filling in a way plain seeds could never match. From that first bite onward, bread was no longer just an accident. It became a practice, a ritual, a cornerstone of life. Families carried grinding stones with them as they moved, heavy objects that took 2 hands to use but worth every ounce, because with them came the ability to turn hard kernels into flour. Children grew up watching their mothers kneel over the stones, rocking back and forth, the sound of grit and grain, a constant background to daily life. Flour dust clung to their skin, their clothes, their hair, a quiet reminder that food was always being prepared. And every day, the flatbread reappeared, fresh from the stone or the clay oven, steaming in the cool of morning. It was more than food. It was stability, a promise of nourishment when other foods were scarce. Hunting could fail, fruits and vegetables came only in season, but if the harvest of grain was stored well, bread could be made whenever needed. And because it could be carried easily, wrapped in cloth or tucked into a pouch, it became travel food, soldier food, farmer food. You can almost imagine the satisfaction of a weary laborer pausing midfield, pulling from his bag a piece of bread baked days before, still edible, still sustaining, even stale. It could be softened with water or broth, extending its use. No other food offered such reliability. Over time, bread grew in complexity. People discovered that if flour and water sat long enough, natural yeasts in the air would cause it to bubble and rise. The first leavened bread was likely a happy accident. Dough left too long before baking, but once tasted it could not be forgotten. The airy texture, the softness, the ease of chewing it was a gift that felt divine. Some cultures even saw it as a blessing from the gods. From then on, bakers watched their dough carefully, experimenting, nurturing small bits of old dough to use again, creating the earliest sourdough starters. This careful tending was not just about flavor, but survival. A leavened loaf filled the belly faster, made grains stretch further, turned a handful of seeds into a meal that could feed a family. Bread also took on symbolic weight. It became part of offerings, rituals, and celebrations. To break bread with someone was to share trust, to welcome them. To withhold it was to reject them. And because grain was often taxed or controlled by rulers, bread also became political, its availability tied to power and unrest. But beneath all these layers remained its original purpose, survival through ingenuity. Bread's endurance as a food hack lies in its versatility. Ground grain alone could be porridge, but shaped into dough and baked, it could last longer, travel farther, and be combined with other foods in endless ways. Dipped in oil, smeared with honey, torn into stews, it became the canvas of meals. Even crumbs were not wasted. They thickened soups or fed animals. In ancient kitchens, nothing was ever truly lost. Think too of the sensory memory bread must have carried. The rhythm of grinding stones, the smell of baking, the sight of loaves stacked high, the feel of warmth in the hands. All of it became tied to comfort, to the idea of being fed and safe. And when famine threatened, it was often bread that decided whether people endured. A bad grain harvest was disaster. Breadless days meant hunger, which is why so many ancient prayers, across cultures, mention bread as a gift to be granted, not taken for granted. And yet, despite its central role, bread was never static. Every region adapted it to its own grains and tools. In Egypt, thin flatbreads baked in clay ovens became daily fare. In Mesopotamia, thicker loaves were shaped and sometimes stuffed. In the Levant, breads were torn and shared around communal meals. Across Europe and Asia, each group had its version, shaped by local grain, weather, and culture. This variety shows how one simple hack grinding grain and cooking it could ripple out endlessly, touching every life. And as it traveled, it became a thread connecting civilizations. Merchants carried not just goods but recipes. Soldiers marched with bread rations. Farmers across continents, who never met or knew of each other, still shared the same daily motion of grinding grain and baking it into sustenance. In that shared act, humanity was bound together. Bread made survival not only possible but predictable, turning fragile existence into something steadier. Imagine again the quiet of the night, the fire crackling, and someone breaking a flatbread into pieces, handing them out to children, to family, to neighbors. Each bite is more than nourishment. It is safety. It is continuity. It is the assurance that, thanks to the cleverness of those first experiments, tomorrow would hold enough to eat. That is the true magic of ancient bread. not the simplicity of its recipe, but the enormity of its impact. It was not just food, it was survival, culture, and memory baked into every bite. Alright, let me take the story of segment 8 and stretch it out into one flowing narration. No breaks, no dashes, just a steady current of words that pulls you along. Here we go. Fermentation is one of those ancient miracles that seems almost too simple to explain, yet it changed human survival in ways that ripple down to us even now. Imagine yourself thousands of years ago in a world without refrigerators or freezers or sealed plastic bags. A world where every fresh food spoiled within days and hunger loomed constantly over families. Then picture a pot of porridge or fruit juice or milk forgotten in a corner of a hut. Instead of rotting into waste, it slowly transforms. The smell shifts, the flavor changes, bubbles rise. What should have been useless becomes something not only edible but sometimes tastier, more nourishing, and safer to consume. People who stumbled across this strange transformation may have thought it was magic, or perhaps the favor of gods, but it was in truth the work of invisible microbes. They did not know the science, but they learned to trust the results. Fermentation turned fragile harvests into food that endured, and this invisible partnership between human and microbe quietly saved lives again and again. One of the earliest and most significant discoveries was beer. Grain was the backbone of many early civilizations, but once harvested it could spoil or be eaten by pests. Someone discovered that if grain porridge was left to sit with water, it began to bubble and change into something new. That something was beer. A drink that could last for weeks or months without rotting. It was rich in calories, safe to drink compared to river water, and filled the stomach with warmth and satisfaction. In Mesopotamia, Sumerian tablets recorded recipes for beer thousands of years ago, showing how central it was to daily life. In Egypt, workers building the pyramids were given beer rations every day, thick and nourishing like liquid bread, fueling both body and spirit as they labored under the desert sun. Beer was never just a drink. It became a social bond, a reward for work, an offering to gods, and a source of comfort in hard times. Families brewed it at home, communities celebrated with it, and over time beer became a thread woven tightly into human history. Wine too had its place, though it spoke a different language of survival and culture. Grapes ferment easily when their skins split, releasing juice that wild yeasts quickly turn into alcohol. The result is wine, sharp, potent, and intoxicating. In Greece, it was linked to Dionysus, the god of revelry and ecstasy. While the Romans raised their cups to Bacchus, wine was more than drink. It became ritual, it became philosophy, it became the very symbol of civilization for those who produced it. Banquets were not complete without it, and entire economies were built around vineyards and trade routes that carried amphorae of wine across the Mediterranean. Wine preserved the harvest of grapes far longer than fresh fruit could last, and it offered a way to experience joy, transformation, and even a sense of touching the divine. Where beer was for laborers, wine was often for elites, but both shared the same secret power. They made fragile crops endure and provided nourishment and safety. When water was uncertain and harvests were lean, dairy brought its own quiet miracle. Fresh milk from cows, goats or sheep spoils quickly, especially in heat, but when it sours or curdles, it can become cheese, yogurt, or butter. Legend says a traveler once carried milk in an animal skin, only to find it had thickened into curds along the way. From that discovery came cheese, a food that could last weeks or months, feed travelers, and sustain whole communities. For nomadic people, cheese was the perfect solution, portable, rich in protein, durable on long journeys. For farmers, it meant that milk surplus was never wasted. Yogurt, tangy and nourishing, also appeared, offering health benefits long before anyone understood probiotics. Butter extended the usefulness of milk even further, adding richness to meals. Through dairy fermentation, people could stretch fleeting moments of abundance into enduring nourishment, a true food hack against hunger. Vegetables too were transformed by fermentation. In ancient China, cabbages preserved in salted water became tangy and long-lasting. This was the ancestor of pickles and kimchi, foods that carried people through long winters when fresh greens were gone. In Europe, sauerkraut emerged, offering not only preservation but vital nutrients like vitamin C that unknowingly protected sailors from scurvy centuries later. These fermented vegetables did more than keep hunger at bay. They kept people healthy, filling their bodies with what fresh harvests could no longer supply during lean months. Imagine a harsh winter, fields barren, no fruit or greens in sight, and yet jars of fermented vegetables stood ready, brimming with flavor and life. That was the power of fermentation, a bridge over the gap between seasons, a guard against the hunger that lurked at the edges of existence. Fermentation also unlocked energy hidden in foods. For example, soybeans are notoriously hard to digest in their raw state. In Asia, fermentation transformed them into miso, soy sauce, and tempeh, foods that were not only edible, but delicious and long-lasting. What had once been tough and inedible became a cornerstone of diets, rich in protein and flavor. This was the genius of fermentation. It did not just preserve, it improved. Foods became tastier, easier to digest, sometimes even safer. In some cases, fermentation removed toxins or pathogens that could make people sick, replacing them with acids or alcohols that killed harmful microbes. People may not have understood why, but they learned to trust the process. Across the world, fermentation took countless forms, shaped by the ingredients at hand. Honey left to ferment became mead, one of the oldest alcoholic drinks known to humanity. Fish packed with salt and left to ferment produced garum, the beloved sauce of the Romans that flavored everything from bread to meat. Coffee and cacao, though now associated with luxury and energy, also required fermentation to unlock their flavors. Even bread owes much to fermentation, as wild yeasts lift dough into soft loaves instead of leaving it dense and heavy. Each of these transformations was a hack discovered not through theory, but through patient observation and survival. People noticed what worked and passed it on, generation after generation, until it became tradition, culture, even religion. The beauty of fermentation lies in its invisibility. For ancient people, it was a mystery that felt like the work of gods. They invoked deities for wine and beer. They treated fermentation vessels as sacred. They offered the first cup to spirits. Yet beneath the ritual was something far more practical: survival. Without fermentation, much of humanity would have starved, or suffered from waterborne illness, or failed to endure harsh winters. Fermentation was not just about pleasure, though it certainly brought that. It was a safety net, a shield against famine, a whisper of resilience in a fragile world. When you think about it, fermentation was perhaps the most human of all ancient hacks. It showed that people could work with the invisible, harness forces they did not understand, and turn loss into life. It turned spoilage into survival, accident into art, necessity into culture. And in every sip of beer, every bite of cheese, every spoonful of sauerkraut, we can still taste the ingenuity of those long-ago hands that learned to trust the bubbling, tangy magic that quietly saved lives. Salt has always seemed so ordinary to us today, just a pinch shaken onto our food without much thought. Yet when you step back into the past, into the kitchens and camps of ancient people, it becomes almost magical. A crystal that held life together, and a substance that shaped survival in ways that few things ever did. Imagine yourself standing in the sweltering sun of an ancient village, perhaps in Egypt or Mesopotamia, where the summer heat beat down on baskets of fish hauled from the river, or cuts of meat freshly butchered from the herd, and you would know instinctively that without some trick to guard them, these foods would turn quickly, attracting flies, souring with the smell of rot, and leaving people sick or hungry. It was salt that saved them. With a careful rubbing of these strange white crystals, or by packing the food tightly into jars filled with salty brine, suddenly what was fragile and fleeting could endure. A fish that might last only a day in the summer heat could become something that carried through weeks or months. A haunch of meat that would once have spoiled overnight could travel across deserts on camelback, or sail across the sea in a barrel on a ship hold. This was not merely convenience, it was survival, a hack of the most profound kind, discovered not in laboratories or workshops, but in the shared trial and error of ordinary people, who desperately needed their food to last longer than nature intended. To understand how powerful this was, picture a caravan of traders crossing the Sahara or the Silk Road, with bales of cloth, jars of spices, and among them, heavy sacks of salt and barrels of salted food. These people were walking for weeks, often through barren landscapes where fresh meat and fish were nowhere to be found. Without salted stores, they would not have survived the crossing. Salted camel meat or dried strips of fish meant that life could stretch further than the land seemed to allow. At sea, the story was the same. Ancient sailors, whether they were Phoenician merchants hugging the Mediterranean coast or later Roman fleets moving supplies for their armies, depended on salted rations. They packed barrels of salted pork, dried fish layered in salt, and even hard cheese rubbed with salt to stop it from spoiling. Imagine a ship caught in a storm, its sails torn, drifting for days or weeks. But when the sea finally calmed and the sailors staggered back to their stores, they found barrels still filled with food that had not spoiled, that tasted of the sea, but gave them the strength to live. Entire empires depended on this trick. The Roman army, with its endless marches and campaigns, was fueled not just by discipline or tactics, but by salted pork and fish that could be carried without fear of rot. It was logistics more than glory that won wars, and salt was the quiet general behind the legions. But it was not just armies and traders who leaned on this mineral. Farmers and villagers, people with small homes and hungry children, turned to salt as a way to carry the bounty of one season into the next. Picture a farmer's wife in a northern village, slicing cucumbers and packing them into jars, pouring salty water over them to make pickles that would sit safe through the cold months when nothing green grew in the fields. Or picture a family in China thousands of years ago, salting cabbage and fermenting it into something far more than food. A dish that would become kimchi, filled with life-saving vitamins in a time when fresh greens were scarce. In the Middle East, shepherds churned butter and then salted it, pressing it into jars that would keep for months, so that even when their herds were far away, they still had fat and nourishment. Salt was security. Salt was peace of mind. Salt was the difference between watching food spoil and knowing that tomorrow there would still be something to eat. Because it was so essential, salt became more than food. It became treasure. Trade routes sprang up across continents, carrying not only silks and spices, but blocks of salt, cut from desert deposits, scraped from dried lake beds, or harvested from the sea. Entire cities grew rich from controlling the salt trade. In some regions, salt was weighed out like precious metals, used as currency itself. Soldiers were sometimes paid in salt, which gave birth to the word salary, a reminder of just how deeply survival and salt were bound together. Wars were fought over salt mines, and empires guarded their sources as jealously as gold. Without salt, you could not feed armies. Without salt, you could not move goods across oceans. Without salt, you could not survive a hard winter. It is hard for us to feel this weight now, when a cheap packet of salt can be bought in any corner shop. But in ancient times, salt was a hinge on which whole civilizations swung. And yet it was not only a tool of preservation and trade, but a symbol. Salt had spiritual resonance. To share salt with someone was to seal a bond. Bread and salt offered to a guest was a way of saying, "You are safe here, you are part of us." And betrayal after breaking salt together was considered among the deepest of shames. Salt appeared in religious rituals, sprinkled in offerings, burned in sacred fires, or carried in pouches for protection. Even spilling salt could carry a weight of superstition, seen as an omen of misfortune. What started as a hack to keep meat and fish from rotting became part of the fabric of meaning in people's lives. If you close your eyes, you can almost see the relief salt must have brought. A mother in a snowbound hut, opening a jar of pickled vegetables and feeding her children when nothing fresh could be found. A soldier tearing off a piece of tough salted pork and finding the strength to march another day. A caravan leader breaking dried salted meat and sharing it with his companions. Their spirits lifted as they crossed a wasteland. Even the taste of salt itself was more than flavor. It was memory, carrying the sea inland, carrying life across barren deserts, carrying safety into the unknown. And it was not only meat and fish that salt transformed. Salt enabled fermentation, a quiet biological trick that made food not only last but often become more nutritious. Think of olives soaking in brine until their bitterness softened, turning into a staple that graced tables across the Mediterranean. Think of cabbage fermenting into sauerkraut in Europe, which preserved vitamin C and kept scurvy at bay during long winters and voyages. Think of soy sauce, born of salted beans in China, that not only flavored food, but kept it edible far beyond its natural span. Salt was the silent partner in all these miracles. In its presence, food did not just endure, it evolved. When you walk through history with salt in mind, you see how much rested upon it. Salt roads cut across mountains, salt taxes built treasuries, salt kept empires marching, and in quieter corners it kept children alive through the hunger seasons. kept sailors from starving, and let ordinary people breathe easier, knowing their food would not vanish overnight. In that sense, it was not only a hack of preservation, but a hack of time itself, a way of pushing back against the limits of nature, of bending perishability into permanence. So tonight, as we talk of ancient food hacks that saved lives, let salt linger in your imagination. Think of those small white grains, so simple and so overlooked, and yet remember that without them, many journeys would have ended in silence, many winters would have taken more lives, many armies would never have marched beyond their borders, and many cultures might never have thrived at all. Salt was not just seasoning, it was salvation, a quiet miracle that sat on the tongue and in the soul, preserving not only food, but the very continuity of human life. Grains have been the quiet backbone of human survival for millennia, but it was not merely the act of harvesting them that saved lives. It was the ingenuity with which ancient people transformed them into something enduring, edible, and sustaining that carried communities through scarcity and hardship. Imagine a field of wheat or barley swaying in the wind under the golden sun, the stalks, heavy with kernels that would feed families, armies, and entire civilizations. Yet harvested at the wrong time or improperly stored, these same kernels could become useless, eaten by pests, spoiled by damp, or lost to rot. Ancient people learned through trial and error that by drying grains carefully, by storing them in cool, dry spaces, and by creating new ways to process them, they could stretch a handful of seeds into months of nourishment. The earliest breads, simple flatbreads baked on hot stones, were not just food, but symbols of survival, and over time these grains found endless forms: porridge, gruel, cakes, and eventually leavened bread, each a testament to human creativity and the relentless need to feed the body reliably. Picture a mother in a small village grinding grain on a stone, dust rising into the air as her hands moved in practiced circles, knowing that the flour she produced would feed her children and grandchildren. Imagine the sound of families gathering around morning fires, stirring thick porridges, baking flatbreads, or breaking into slightly risen loaves, the scent of baked grain filling the air with comfort and assurance, the taste of nourishment lingering long after the meal is done. Grains were versatile, able to be stored dry for long periods or cooked into filling meals, able to be combined with herbs, salt, or even early dairy products, creating a food that could satisfy hunger in countless ways. And yet the true genius lay not just in cooking, but in preservation and transport. Early civilizations discovered that drying grains, whether wheat, barley, millet, or rice, allowed them to be stored in pottery jars, woven baskets, or pits lined with straw, ensuring that even when the rains failed, when rivers ran low, when the hunt yielded nothing, people could still eat. Grains became the quiet currency of survival, the foundation on which armies marched, traders traveled, and empires flourished. Soldiers on campaigns carried dried grains that could be boiled into porridge on the road, feeding large numbers with minimal effort, turning the humble kernel into the engine of conquest. Traders packed grain in sacks, traveling for weeks through deserts or mountains, knowing that a sack of dried wheat or barley could feed a caravan even in the most inhospitable conditions. In homes, grains provided consistency. They could be measured, rationed, and stretched through lean times. They were combined with water or milk to make filling meals that sustained workers in fields, builders on construction sites, and mothers tending children. Grain storage also demanded ingenuity. People learned to elevate storage pits, line them with straw, seal them with clay, or even use naturally cool caves, all in the effort to keep vermin, moisture, and heat from destroying their precious stores. The lessons were hard-won. Spoiled grain could mean famine, and people lived in constant awareness of the cycles of planting and harvest. The most careful preparation could mean the difference between life and death. Grains were also transformed into more than food. They became instruments of social cohesion and culture. Milling stones were passed down through generations, recipes shared, and baking became ritual. In some cultures, bread and porridge were offered to gods, presented as part of religious ceremonies, or used to mark celebrations and rites of passage. The daily act of grinding, baking, or boiling grain was embedded with meaning, connecting ordinary survival to spiritual life. The versatility of grains also allowed them to integrate into every meal and setting. Porridges and gruels could be flavored with honey, herbs, or salt. Flatbreads could accompany stews, cheese, or fermented foods. Leftover grain could be sprouted to make beer. another form of nourishment that doubled as hydration and calories for laborers and travelers. Across continents, grains became the foundation of diets, shaping trade networks, economies, and even empires. Grain silos in Egypt, granaries in Mesopotamia, and storage jars across China all demonstrate the same principle: the preservation of life through careful planning, ingenuity, and an understanding of how to extend the natural bounty of the earth. The story of grains is also one of adaptation. In regions with harsh climates, people selected the hardiest varieties. In wetter lands, they perfected drying techniques. In colder regions, grains were combined with animal fat or milk to make them palatable and filling. This adaptability allowed human societies to thrive in a dizzying array of environments, all because the kernel of wheat, barley, rice, or millet could be transformed through preparation and preservation. And as grains traveled along trade routes, they carried not only sustenance but culture. Recipes, techniques, and innovations spread from one region to another. Ancient Egypt passed knowledge of bread and beer to the Levant. Mesopotamian techniques influenced Persia, and Asian rice cultivation spread westward, changing diets and economies along the way. Grains were not passive commodities. They were catalysts of civilization. Their cultivation, storage, and preparation were acts of foresight and creativity that allowed societies to grow, move, and endure. Every bowl of porridge, every baked flatbread, every carefully stored sack represented more than mere survival. It represented mastery over nature's unpredictability, the ability to convert a fragile harvest into a lasting resource, and the quiet triumph of human ingenuity. When famine loomed, it was grains that held families together. When armies marched, it was grains that fueled them. When trade caravans crossed deserts, it was grains that sustained them. And when civilizations flourished, it was because grains were abundant, stored with care, and prepared with knowledge honed over centuries. Grains remind us that even the simplest foods, when treated with attention and understanding, can change the course of history. They turn the ordinary into extraordinary, the fleeting into enduring, and hunger into hope. In every crunch of a hard-baked loaf, in every warm spoonful of porridge, there is the echo of thousands of years of ingenuity, labor, and survival instinct. This is why grains were more than food. They were one of humanity's earliest and most powerful hacks, a tool that transformed raw seeds into enduring sustenance, a quiet, steady force that kept people alive when the world offered little, and a bridge between generations that ensured knowledge, nourishment, and life itself could pass from hand to hand, from parent to child, from one village to another, across the windswept plains, along riverbanks, through mountains, and across deserts, forever shaping the story of humanity, with every kernel stored, cooked, and consumed. Grains, salted meats, fermented vegetables, and ancient breads were only part of the story of survival in the human past. Because another vital food hack that quietly shaped civilizations was the clever use of honey and other natural sweeteners, substances that were at once food, medicine, and preservation agents, carrying people through seasons of scarcity and illness in ways that we rarely consider today. Imagine a dense forest buzzing with the hum of insects and the scent of wildflowers, where early humans discovered the most miraculous gift hidden in the trees, dripping golden from the comb, sticky, viscous, and unlike anything else they had tasted. Honey was extraordinary, not just for its sweetness, but for its ability to endure. While fruits rotted, grains spoiled, and dairy soured, honey remained unchanged, resisting decay and bacterial spoilage in ways that must have seemed magical. To taste it fresh from the comb was one thing, but to discover that it could be stored for months or years and remain edible would have been revolutionary, transforming survival strategies for families, hunters, and gatherers alike. People learned to store honey in clay pots, often sealed carefully to keep out moisture and insects, creating a pantry that could be carried from one season to the next, a golden reservoir of energy waiting to be tapped when the world offered little else. Honey was not just sugar, it was concentrated life, packed with calories, minerals, and in many ways, medicine. It healed wounds when applied topically, soothed sore throats when mixed with warm water or herbs, and even acted as a subtle preservative when combined with other foods. Ancient people mixed it with grains to make early forms of cereal bars or energy cakes, or with fruit to produce long-lasting preserves. In some cultures, honey was fermented into mead, a drink that could nourish, embolden, and preserve both liquid and caloric content while carrying the cultural weight of ritual and celebration. Imagine a traveler or hunter setting out from the village, carrying a small pot of honey as both food and medicine. A few spoonfuls could sustain energy for hours, heal cuts or infections, or sweeten the bland porridge made from grains and water. It was versatile, portable, and reliable, and in a world where fresh food was often unpredictable, that reliability was priceless. Beyond individual households, honey shaped economies and trade networks. In ancient Egypt, Greece, and Mesopotamia, honey was highly valued, often more so than gold, because it preserved life in ways other foods could not. Caravans would carry jars of honey across deserts, up mountains, and along rivers, ensuring that both rulers and common people had access to a substance that could sustain bodies through the harshest conditions. Honey was also central to rituals, offerings, and spiritual practices. Its unspoiled sweetness symbolized purity, continuity, and divine favor. In some traditions, honey was offered to gods to secure protection, blessings, or abundance, reinforcing its dual role as both sustenance and symbol. Think about the painstaking effort it took to harvest it from wild hives, often high in trees or cliffs, a dangerous task that required courage, patience, and knowledge passed down through generations. The honey-gatherers became guardians of life itself, collecting the golden treasure that would feed children, heal the sick, and sweeten hard days. And the ingenuity did not stop at honey alone. People discovered maple sap, palm sap, and other natural sweeteners, often boiling them down to create syrupy, concentrated stores that could last through months of scarcity. In regions with sugarcane, early forms of crystallized sugar were developed, providing a stable source of energy that could be transported over long distances without spoiling. These discoveries were not trivial. They allowed ancient communities to expand into areas where food was seasonal, unpredictable, or difficult to store. Sweeteners were portable calories, a source of quick energy during hunts, journeys, or wars, and often acted as emergency rations in times of famine. They were combined with grains, fruits, nuts, and seeds to make nutrient-dense, long-lasting food that could be eaten on the move or stored for future use. Honey and sweeteners were also deeply tied to the development of medicine and hygiene. People observed that wounds coated with honey healed faster, that infections slowed or disappeared, and that adding honey to warm drinks could calm fever or digestive distress. These were not accidental discoveries, but careful observations repeated over generations, refined and embedded in cultural practices. In this way, honey was more than food. It was a bridge between nourishment and survival, between taste and health, between the ordinary and the sacred. Consider a winter in a mountainous village, snow covering fields, rivers frozen, food stores low, and yet a small pot of honey could sustain a family for days, spoonful by spoonful, in porridge, in teas, or eaten plain. That pot might also be used to soothe a cough, treat a small burn, or be shared with neighbors in a gesture of goodwill and survival. Its presence represented security and foresight, the ability to stretch scarcity into endurance. Honey's importance extended into culture and ceremony as well. Weddings, harvest festivals, and religious rites often included honey, cementing its status as a gift of life, a sacred substance that transcended mere calories. In the same way that salt preserved meats and fish, or fermentation extended the life of grains and vegetables, honey was a form of concentrated survival. It captured sunlight, the work of flowers and bees, and stored it for humans to use when nature gave them nothing else. Across continents and eras, people learned to combine honey with other foods to extend their shelf life and energy value. Mixed with nuts, it created dense energy bites. Combined with grains, it became a sustaining porridge. Added to fruit preserves, it extended edibility for months, providing essential calories when the harvest was gone. Honey was also a social glue. Sharing it could cement alliances, reward labor, or seal agreements. Its rarity in certain regions made it precious, yet its universal usefulness made it essential. Its presence in trade routes, stored in clay jars, shows that people understood its immense practical value. Every spoonful represented labor, ingenuity, and foresight. Honey was so powerful a tool that it even shaped exploration. Ancient sailors carried it on long voyages, knowing it would not spoil, that it could sweeten the meager rations they brought. and that it could stave off fatigue or illness when fresh food was impossible. In deserts, mountain passes, and frozen plains, honey was a consistent ally. Its ability to endure the elements and provide concentrated nourishment made it a true food hack, one that saved lives, silently, without fanfare, yet with impact that reverberated through communities and generations. When we taste honey today, we are tasting the results of thousands of years of observation, trial, and ingenuity. We are tasting the cleverness of people who learned that the natural world, in collaboration with careful human attention, could produce something that nourished, healed, and preserved. Honey represents the intersection of survival, culture, and science. Long before anyone had the words or understanding to describe it, it was food, medicine, and magic all at once, a constant companion to families, travelers, and communities. Its golden glow captured hope in times of scarcity, sweetness in times of hardship, and the power to endure when other foods failed. In every ancient pot, jar, or comb, there was life preserved, energy stored, and care passed down from one generation to the next, ensuring that humanity could continue, even when the world itself seemed harsh and unpredictable. Honey reminds us that some of the most profound food hacks were also the simplest. By observing nature, by paying attention to the gifts of bees, and using it wisely, humans created a tool that was at once versatile, nutritious, preservative, medicinal, and symbolic. It was not just sweetness, it was survival crystallized, a sticky golden lifeline that carried people through hunger, illness, and long journeys, a substance so enduring that thousands of years later, archaeologists still find pots of honey preserved in tombs, untouched, unspoiled, a testament to the ingenuity and wisdom of the people who first discovered its power and used it to save lives across time and space. Legumes and pulses are often overlooked in the stories of ancient survival. Yet they were one of the most brilliant and consistent food hacks that humanity developed, quietly sustaining entire communities through famine, war, and the harsh unpredictability of nature. Imagine an ancient field, the sun blazing down on small plants, heavy with pods filled with beans, lentils, chickpeas, or peas, each tiny seed representing not only nourishment, but a marvel of preservation and portability. Unlike meat that spoiled quickly, milk that soured, or fruits that could rot in days, these legumes could be harvested and dried, stored for months or even years, providing a reliable source of protein, fiber, and essential nutrients that people would desperately need when other foods were scarce. Ancient farmers learned to rotate crops, to let legumes fix nitrogen in the soil, improving fertility for the next season. And in doing so, they created a system where the food itself was regenerative, not just for the body but for the land. Think of a farmer in Mesopotamia or the Indus Valley carefully separating the seeds, drying them under the sun, and storing them in clay jars or woven baskets, knowing that these humble beans could feed a family through lean months' travel with soldiers on campaigns, or be sold to traders moving along dusty caravan routes. Pulses were versatile. They could be boiled into thick stews, ground into flours to make dense bread or cakes, or mixed with grains to create a more complete protein, extending the nutritional value of every meal. They were also portable, light, and durable, which made them indispensable for nomadic groups or armies on the move, providing calories and nourishment when fresh food was impossible to obtain. In many ancient societies, pulses became a dietary backbone, not just a supplement. They were combined with herbs, salt, and sometimes honey to create meals that could last for days or weeks without refrigeration. Meals that were simple yet sustaining. Meals that carried life across landscapes that could be unforgiving. Beyond sustenance, legumes carried deep cultural significance. They were often associated with fertility, abundance, and longevity, given in rituals, offerings, or as gifts to mark important occasions. In some regions, eating pulses was considered a blessing, a way to ensure health and strength, reflecting a wisdom passed down through generations that recognized their vital role in survival. The genius of pulses also lies in their adaptability. They could grow in poor soils where other crops failed, tolerate droughts, and endure harsh conditions, making them ideal for sustaining populations in environments that were unpredictable and often unforgiving. Ancient civilizations learned to combine pulses with other preserved foods, creating complete meals that could sustain entire armies or communities. Imagine Roman soldiers marching across Europe, carrying dried lentils or chickpeas alongside salted meat, beer or grains, knowing that these legumes could be cooked into nourishing stews on the road, keeping them strong and alert over long campaigns. Or picture a family in the Andes or Himalayas, living at high altitude with limited arable land, relying on dried peas, beans, and lentils to provide the calories and protein necessary to survive harsh winters when fields were snowbound. Pulses were also remarkably flexible in cooking methods, absorbing flavors, stretching with grains, and transforming into hearty soups, porridges, or baked goods that could satisfy hunger in multiple ways. Their combination with grains was particularly clever, as it created a balanced protein profile, something that neither food alone could fully provide, allowing ancient people to meet their dietary needs even when animal protein was scarce or unavailable. This simple yet brilliant hack of using legumes as a staple allowed civilizations to expand, migrate, and endure. Entire trade networks emerged around these dried pulses, carried in sacks across deserts, mountains, and rivers, ensuring that even remote communities could access nutrition that was reliable, long-lasting, and easy to store, and their longevity is astonishing. Archaeologists still find lentils, chickpeas, and beans in ancient storage pits, preserved for thousands of years, a testament to the ingenuity of those who first harvested, dried, and stored them. Legumes were not glamorous, but they were essential, often replacing what could not be grown, hunted, or preserved otherwise. They were an egalitarian food, accessible to peasants and rulers alike, valued for utility rather than taste, yet capable of becoming comforting. Hearty meals when prepared thoughtfully. Think of a simple pot of lentil stew simmering over a fire, the smell rising into a cold morning air, the steam carrying warmth and reassurance, the tiny seeds swelling into a thick, nourishing meal that could sustain a family through the day, week, or even months. In this way, legumes exemplify one of the oldest lessons of human ingenuity, that survival is not always about luxury or abundance, but about smart choices, preparation, and understanding how to make what is available endure. They turn scarcity into stability, unpredictability into dependability, hunger into satisfaction, and in doing so, they quietly saved countless lives without fanfare. Beyond their physical benefits, pulses also fostered community and knowledge sharing. Recipes, cooking methods, and preservation techniques were passed down orally, creating traditions and practices that linked generations together through shared understanding and care. Children learned to prepare simple stews, parents taught how to store and dry seeds, and elders advised on planting rotations and combinations with grains. This knowledge was as much a lifeline as the legumes themselves, creating a cultural backbone alongside the nutritional one. And while honey preserved sweetness, salt preserved meats, and fish and fermentation extended fruits and vegetables, legumes stood as a quiet hero of endurance, providing the constant, reliable sustenance that allowed humans to withstand famine, travel vast distances, endure wars, and sustain populations through harsh climates and unpredictable seasons. They were also an early tool of diet optimization, showing an understanding of complementary foods long before nutrition science existed, a recognition that mixing beans with grains or seeds created a stronger, more complete nourishment than relying on a single source alone. In every pod, every dried seed, there was life preserved, energy stored, and knowledge passed forward. They were a silent, steadfast partner to survival, a humble yet extraordinary innovation that transformed the way humans approached food. And when we eat beans or lentils today, whether boiled, roasted, or ground, we are participating in a tradition that stretches back thousands of years, a practice that once saved lives in times of famine, war, and environmental hardship, a testament to human observation, patience, and ingenuity. Legumes were not flashy. They did not attract admiration in the way that wine, honey, or salted meats might. They were quiet, durable, and reliable, yet in their simplicity lay the power to sustain life across generations. They are proof that sometimes the most profound solutions to survival are found not in complexity or extravagance, but in patience, foresight, and a deep understanding of the natural world. Through legumes, humans learned that life could be prolonged not only by hunting the largest prey or gathering the sweetest fruit, but by cultivating, drying, storing, and cooking in ways that maximized nutrition, longevity, and resilience. Each pod was a seed of survival, each stew a lesson in endurance, and each storage jar a vault of life-saving potential that ensured that communities could withstand the vagaries of climate, conflict, and scarcity. Pulses remind us that true food hacks do not always come with spectacle. Sometimes they are the quiet, enduring solutions that underpin civilization itself, the humble, reliable foundations upon which humans built empires, traveled vast distances, and survived against the odds. They show that survival often depends not on abundance alone, but on knowledge, foresight, and the clever transformation of what the natural world provides. And in every bite of lentils, beans, or peas, there is a connection to those long-ago hands, who first realized that these simple seeds, when harvested, dried, stored, and cooked carefully, could become a lifeline, a constant companion in a precarious world, a quiet hero of human endurance, and a testament to ingenuity that continues to nourish us even today. In the long, unpredictable tapestry of human survival, one of the most underrated and quietly brilliant hacks was the discovery and use of nuts and seeds. Small treasures packed with energy, fat, and nutrients that could be gathered, stored, and carried across seasons and landscapes, providing sustenance when other food sources faltered. Imagine a woodland or savanna hundreds or thousands of years ago, with ancient humans bending beneath the branches of trees, heavy with almonds, walnuts, hazelnuts, or acorns, each nut representing a concentrated package of calories and life capable of sustaining hunters, gatherers, and early farmers during times when grains were scarce or meat was unavailable. Nuts were remarkable because they were inherently durable. Their hard shells protected the valuable edible kernel inside from spoilage, pests, and the elements, meaning that these small gifts of nature could be stored for months or even years without losing nutrition. Early people discovered not just that nuts were edible, but that they could be prepared in a variety of ways to maximize their usefulness. Some were eaten raw, cracked open to reveal the rich, oily kernels that provided immediate energy. Others were roasted, a process that enhanced flavor, made digestion easier, and sometimes neutralized bitter tannins. As with acorns or some varieties of walnuts, nuts were also ground into flours or pastes, combined with grains, honey, or dried fruits to make portable energy bars or dense, long-lasting meals that could be carried on journeys, fed to children, or stored for emergencies. Seeds, often smaller and more delicate, offered similar advantages. Sunflower seeds, pumpkin seeds, sesame, flax, and others could be harvested, dried, and stored, providing concentrated nutrition that was light to carry but heavy in sustenance. Imagine a nomadic tribe in Central Asia or North America, collecting handfuls of seeds, drying them in the sun, and carrying them in pouches across mountains and plains. A small handful could provide hours of energy, stave off hunger during long hunts or migrations, and ensure survival when no other food was immediately available. The ingenuity did not stop at simply gathering and eating them. People learned to combine nuts and seeds with other preserved foods, such as grains, legumes, or dried fruits, creating balanced, energy-dense meals that maximized every calorie. These combinations provided fats, proteins, and carbohydrates in a single bite, sustaining laborers, soldiers, and travelers alike. The portability of nuts and seeds also made them central to trade. Traders carried them along routes spanning continents, bartering them for salt, spices, or other preserved goods. Entire markets in ancient cities were devoted to these small treasures, which were often as valuable as precious metals in regions where stored energy was a necessity for survival. Nuts also carried cultural and symbolic weight. In many societies, they represented fertility, abundance, and prosperity, often given as gifts during festivals or included in offerings to gods. They were a food of the gods in some traditions and a reliable source of life for ordinary people in daily practice. Their presence in rituals and ceremonies underscores their importance beyond mere nutrition, showing that humans instinctively recognize the dual role of food as sustenance and symbol. The long-term utility of nuts and seeds is also astonishing. Acorns could be leached to remove bitterness and ground into flour, providing a vital carbohydrate source in regions where grains were difficult to cultivate. Almonds and walnuts could be pressed for oil, which could be used not only in cooking but also for preservation and as a fuel source for lamps, extending their usefulness beyond the table. Seeds such as flax were pressed for oil or combined with water and honey to make energy pastes that could be stored for months. Their versatility meant that in almost every environment, people could find a way to convert these small, hardy foods into something sustaining, portable, and life-saving. Think of a winter in a forested region, snow blanketing the ground and freezing the rivers, and yet a family could crack open nuts stored from the autumn harvest, roast them over a small fire, and create a hot, nourishing meal that kept hunger at bay. Think of a hunter in the savannah or steppe, carrying a pouch of mixed seeds that provided immediate energy while tracking game or moving between settlements. Imagine the relief and reassurance that such a small resource could provide in an uncertain world. Nuts and seeds were also critical in combination with other food hacks. Mixed with honey, they became energy bars. Combined with grains, they became calorie-rich breads or porridge. Pressed for oil, they became a cooking medium or preservative. In each case, they extended the life, energy, and usability of the meals around them, multiplying the effectiveness of other survival strategies. Their value in endurance and resilience cannot be overstated. Unlike meat, which spoiled quickly, or dairy, which soured in heat, nuts and seeds could be stored with minimal preparation, making them indispensable in journeys, wartime campaigns, and periods of famine. Armies marching across mountains or deserts relied on them. Nomadic tribes moving through harsh landscapes depended on them. Families enduring harsh winters trusted them as reliable sustenance. The harvest of nuts and seeds also shaped seasonal rhythms and labor practices. People learned to track the maturation of trees and plants, to gather at the precise moment before pests or storms could claim the bounty, to store carefully and ration judiciously. These practices demanded observation, patience, and foresight, creating knowledge, systems, and cultural habits that extended far beyond nutrition. Nuts and seeds became a nexus where ecology, survival, and human ingenuity intersected. The nutritional density of these foods was particularly remarkable. Packed with fats and proteins, they provided more calories per ounce than almost any other plant food, meaning that even small portions could sustain laborers, travelers, and children. Combined with legumes, grains, or dried fruits, they created meals that were balanced, long, and portable, perfectly suited to a world without refrigeration or quick access to fresh foods. Over centuries, these small food hacks of nuts and seeds influenced trade, travel, settlement patterns, and even social hierarchies. Wealthy households prized certain varieties, preserving them carefully or gifting them to demonstrate status. Farmers relied on them for winter sustenance. Hunters and travelers relied on their portability. Across continents, the consistent utility of these foods underpins survival, commerce, and culture alike, and the ingenuity extended further still. Early humans discovered that some nuts could be fermented, roasted, or ground into pastes to enhance digestibility and flavor. Seeds could be toasted or ground into flour, pressed for oil, or added to other preserved foods, enhancing both taste and nutritional value. These practices show an understanding of preservation, preparation, and combination that transformed small, simple, natural foods into enduring, life-saving resources. In the grand scope of human survival, nuts and seeds were deceptively powerful. Their presence meant that people could endure scarcity, hunger, and the harsh unpredictability of climate. They allowed for migration, travel, and trade. They supported armies, families, and communities alike. They were simple, humble, and often overlooked, yet in their simplicity lay extraordinary resilience. Every handful of almonds or walnuts cracked open over a fire, every roasted sunflower or pumpkin seed eaten on a journey, represented centuries of observation, adaptation, and the relentless human drive to survive. They remind us that survival often depends on noticing what is abundant, learning how to store it, and combining it cleverly with other resources. Nuts and seeds were not just food. They were energy reserves, survival kits, and cultural symbols all at once, quietly sustaining humanity through periods of scarcity, danger, and uncertainty. And in each bite, they carried the wisdom of generations, the knowledge of the natural world, and the ingenuity of humans who learned that even the smallest, hardest foods could be transformed into life-saving sustenance. In this way, they are a testament to human resilience and the quiet genius of ancient food hacks, proving that sometimes the most unassuming resources hold the greatest power to preserve life, shape culture, and carry civilizations through the challenges of the natural world. In the panorama of ancient survival strategies, one of the most ingenious, yet underappreciated, hacks was the use of fermentation to preserve and enhance food, a process that transformed raw ingredients into lasting nourishment, improved flavors, and even medicine quietly, safeguarding communities from hunger and illness in ways that modern people rarely pause to consider. Imagine standing in a small village or city hundreds or thousands of years ago, the scent of yeast milk or vegetables drifting through the air, mingling with smoke from cooking fires, and realizing that these smells signified not just food, but a remarkable method for turning the perishable into the enduring. Fermentation was a slow alchemy, a harnessing of natural microbes and bacteria to create something greater than the sum of its parts. Milk could be transformed into yogurt or cheese, not only extending its shelf life, but also increasing digestibility and nutritional value. Vegetables could be pickled, turning cabbage into sauerkraut or cucumbers into pickles, providing essential vitamins during long winters when fresh produce was unavailable. Even grains could be fermented into sourdough, beer, or other fermented drinks, creating energy-dense and safe-to-consume foods that could carry travelers across deserts, sailors across seas, or armies through campaigns. The power of fermentation was not just in preservation, but in enhancement. Nutrients could become more bioavailable, probiotics could improve digestive health, and flavors could develop complexity, making otherwise bland staples enjoyable and nourishing. Picture a Roman soldier on the march, relying on fermented grain, porridge, or hardtack soaked in a bit of sourdough starter, finding that these simple, preserved foods provided not only calories but comfort and sustenance in equal measure. In East Asia, early communities discovered that soybeans, when fermented, could become tofu, miso, or soy sauce, offering protein, flavor, and preservation in ways that transformed diets for centuries. The same principle applied in Africa with fermented sorghum, millet, or maize, creating porridges and beverages that were nutrient-rich, safe to consume, and capable of sustaining large populations in regions where food scarcity could be fatal. Fermentation also served as a natural form of medicine. People observed that certain fermented foods could soothe the stomach, prevent spoilage-related illnesses, and even fight infections. Yogurt and kefir, for example, contained bacteria that improved gut health, reducing the incidence of dysentery and other gastrointestinal problems, particularly in times and places where water and food hygiene were not guaranteed. Pickled vegetables provided critical vitamins like C, preventing scurvy during long winters or sea voyages, and fermented drinks could provide hydration and calories when clean water was scarce. The ingenuity of fermentation was also social and cultural. Recipes, starter cultures, and techniques were carefully passed down through generations, creating culinary traditions that connected families, villages, and regions. People experimented with timing, temperature, and ingredients, gradually learning the optimal conditions for each type of fermentation, often without understanding the microbiology behind it, yet achieving remarkable consistency and safety. Think of a woman in a small medieval kitchen tending a vat of fermenting cabbage, stirring daily, adding salt and herbs, and knowing that months from now this humble mixture would provide nourishment and vitamins when the snow-covered fields offered nothing else. Fermentation allowed humans to extend the usefulness of seasonal foods, storing the summer's abundance for the winter months, turning surplus produce into essential survival resources. The preservation of grains, fruits, dairy, and vegetables through fermentation became a cornerstone of resilience, particularly in societies where other storage methods were limited. Fermented foods were also portable, enabling travel, trade, and exploration. A sailor could carry a barrel of fermented fish or vegetables, secure in the knowledge that it would remain edible for weeks at sea. A merchant moving through arid lands could carry fermented grain pastes or beer to sustain caravan members. Armies relied on fermented foods to maintain strength on long campaigns, understanding that spoilage was not merely inconvenient but deadly. Across continents, fermentation shaped trade, diet, and culture. In China, kimchi and pickled vegetables became central to meals and nutrition. In Europe, sauerkraut and cheeses allowed communities to endure harsh winters. In the Americas, maize and bean fermentations ensured nutrition in regions with fluctuating climates. In Africa, fermented porridges and drinks sustained populations across semi-arid lands. The knowledge of fermentation represented both scientific observation and practical experience, a form of wisdom that allowed humans to manipulate natural processes to create reliable, safe, and nourishing food. The act of fermentation required patience, observation, and adaptation. People learned which containers worked best, which temperatures encouraged desirable bacterial growth, which timing prevented spoilage, and how to combine ingredients to maximize both preservation and nutrition. These lessons were handed down orally or through apprenticeships, forming a lineage of knowledge that could sustain entire societies, even in times of hardship. Beyond survival, fermentation became a form of pleasure, flavor, and artistry. Cultures experimented with spices, herbs, and additional ingredients to create a variety of tastes, turning necessity into creativity. This blending of survival and enjoyment highlights the profound adaptability and ingenuity of ancient people, who understood that nourishment could be functional, medicinal, and pleasurable simultaneously. Fermented foods also became symbols of hospitality and community. Sharing a fermented dish at a festival or family gathering reinforced social bonds, trust, and shared identity. The act of preparing and consuming fermented foods connected individuals to cycles of nature, to seasonal abundance, and to ancestral knowledge, reminding people that survival is deeply intertwined with culture and relationships, not merely the consumption of calories. In essence, fermentation allowed humans to bend the natural limitations of perishable foods, turning milk, vegetables, and grains into durable, safe, and nutrient-rich sustenance. It was a quiet form of life insurance, an alchemical process that stored vitality, energy, and health for the future. It empowered communities to survive lean months, travel vast distances, wage campaigns, and explore unfamiliar territories with reliable nutrition. And while modern refrigeration and preservation have largely replaced traditional fermentation in daily life, the legacy of these techniques endures, reminding us that some of the most brilliant food hacks are those that harness nature itself, patiently, creatively, and observantly, turning uncertainty into resilience, scarcity into sustenance, and ordinary ingredients into life-saving treasures. Fermentation was not merely a culinary trick. It was a survival strategy, a scientific discovery embedded in everyday life, a quiet hero that allowed humanity to thrive despite the unpredictability of climate, environment, and circumstance. It represents the enduring ingenuity of our ancestors, their deep understanding of nature's rhythms, and their capacity to innovate under pressure, ensuring that food, life, and culture could endure together. In every spoonful of yogurt, every bite of cheese, every sip of fermented grain drink, and every tangy morsel of pickled vegetables, we are tasting the distilled wisdom of thousands of years, a food hack that saved countless lives and shaped human civilization in profound ways. Salt has always been more than a seasoning. In the story of human survival, it was a magical, life-saving substance, a food hack that quietly sustained civilizations, armies, and families alike, long before refrigeration or modern preservation existed, quietly turning perishable foods into durable stores of life and energy. Imagine standing in the ancient mountains or along a sun-scorched coast, watching people laboriously harvest salt from rock deposits, salt pans, or evaporating seawater, knowing that each crystal represented not only flavor but the power to preserve meat, fish, vegetables, and even grains, to extend the life of what the world otherwise offered only fleetingly. Salt was essential for more than taste. It was crucial to survival, ensuring that vital proteins and nutrients could be kept edible through lean times, long journeys, and harsh climates. Ancient people discovered that by rubbing salt into meat or fish, they could slow decay, keeping the food safe for days, weeks, or even months. Entire economies, trade routes, and political power structures emerged around this simple mineral because it was so indispensable. Picture a Roman legion marching across Europe, carrying salted pork and fish in barrels, knowing that without salt, their rations would spoil quickly, leaving soldiers weakened and vulnerable. Imagine traders in the Sahara transporting slabs of salted meat and dried fish across deserts. Each crystal of salt a tiny insurance policy against starvation, a compact, portable lifeline that allowed humans to endure extreme distances without access to fresh food. Salt was also used in combination with other food hacks, multiplying their effectiveness. Meat preserved in salt could be combined with dried grains or legumes to create nutrient-dense meals capable of sustaining people through long winters or arduous campaigns. Fish preserved in salt provided protein and essential fats in regions where agriculture was limited. Even vegetables could be salted or brined to extend shelf life, creating essential vitamin stores during periods when fresh produce was unavailable. The ingenuity of salt extends beyond preservation. It also regulated human health, particularly in times of scarcity or extreme labor. Salt replenished electrolytes lost through sweat, crucial for people working in fields, marching across deserts, or hauling loads in the heat. It played a role in hydration and metabolism, a reminder that ancient food hacks were not just about storage, but about optimizing the body's resilience under pressure. Entire cultures revered salt for its life-sustaining properties. It became currency in many regions, a commodity so valuable that armies marched to control salt sources, and taxes were levied on its trade. Salt festivals, offerings, and rituals highlighted its dual importance as both sustenance and symbol, a mineral capable of shaping politics, economy, and daily life. Imagine a family in a small mountain village storing blocks of rock salt, grinding them carefully to preserve meat and vegetables for the winter, each crystal a promise of survival when snow-blanketed fields and rivers froze, rendering fresh food impossible to access. Salt allowed humans to store seasonal abundance and stretch it across months of scarcity. In the same way that grains could be dried, honey could be stored, and legumes preserved, salt became an invisible, quiet hero, extending life and sustaining societies. It also enabled exploration. Ancient sailors and merchants relied on salted provisions to cross seas and deserts. Without salt, preserved meats and fish would spoil quickly, leaving crews hungry, weakened, and vulnerable to disease. With it, civilizations could expand, connect through trade, and endure long voyages with confidence in their sustenance. Salt preservation was not simple. It required careful understanding of concentration, timing, and storage. Too little salt, and spoilage would occur. Too much, and food could become inedible. People experimented with techniques, learning to balance moisture, texture, and taste to maximize both preservation and palatability. These lessons were passed down orally or through apprenticeship, becoming a repository of practical knowledge that could save countless lives when environmental conditions were harsh or unpredictable. Consider the psychological comfort as well. Knowing that salted meat, fish, or vegetables could last for months gave people confidence to venture further from home, to endure winter or famine, to travel with armies or trade caravans, knowing that nutrition would not fail them. This confidence was essential, shaping human movement, settlement patterns, and economic expansion. Beyond preservation and health, salt played cultural and symbolic roles. It was a symbol of purity, covenant, and loyalty in many traditions, appearing in religious rituals, offerings, and ceremonies. Sharing salt was an expression of hospitality, friendship, and trust, reflecting an understanding that food sustains not only the body but social bonds. The life-saving nature of salt also extended to emergency situations. During periods of famine, war, or environmental disaster, preserved foods seasoned and cured with salt became crucial lifelines, sustaining people when all else failed. Armies relied on it for survival in campaigns, explorers for endurance in unknown lands, and families for security during harsh seasons. Salt, in essence, transformed the natural bounty of meat, fish, and vegetables into enduring resources, allowing humans to manipulate the fleeting nature of food into something reliable. It empowered societies to endure, adapt, and thrive in environments that would otherwise be unforgiving. Every grain of salt carried energy, preservation, and foresight, a quiet tool of human ingenuity that extended life in ways no other single ingredient could match. When combined with other ancient food hacks, salt's impact multiplied. Meat, fish, legumes, and even certain vegetables could be made portable, durable, and calorie-dense, creating survival kits that supported migrations, trade, exploration, and warfare. Salt was not just a seasoning. It was a foundation of civilization, a mineral whose importance is impossible to overstate. Its discovery and systematic use represent an early and profound human understanding of preservation, nutrition, and strategy. generations learned to balance the practical, nutritional, and social value of salt, incorporating it into everyday life, trade, medicine, and culture. Ancient societies recognized that the preservation of food was inseparable from the preservation of life itself, and salt was central to that understanding. Salt was life crystallized. It allowed humanity to endure harsh winters, long marches, extended voyages, and periods of famine with greater confidence and security. It shaped economies, fueled armies, sustained families, and connected communities across vast distances. The knowledge of how to harvest, store, and use salt effectively was a survival strategy embedded in culture, economy, and daily life, one that had profound consequences for the development of civilizations. In modern times, it is easy to overlook the transformative power of this humble mineral. But for ancient people, it was an indispensable tool, one that ensured that the bounty of the earth could last longer, travel further, and nourish more effectively. It was a silent partner in human ingenuity, a mineral that transformed uncertainty into stability, scarcity into endurance, and simple food into life-saving sustenance. Every preserved fish, every salted hunk of meat, every carefully stored vegetable carried the wisdom of generations, the quiet genius of observation, and the profound understanding that survival depended not only on what you ate, but on how you treated, stored, and prepared it. Salt allowed humans to conquer hunger, manage risk, and extend the usefulness of their food in ways that continue to influence how we eat, store, and think about nutrition today. It is a reminder that the most powerful food hacks were often deceptively simple, relying not on complexity or extravagance, but on patience, knowledge, and foresight. In this way, salt stands alongside grains, honey, legumes, nuts, and fermented foods as a cornerstone of human ingenuity, a substance that saved lives quietly but profoundly, enabling civilizations to endure, expand, and thrive against the odds. Its presence in ancient kitchens, trade caravans, and battlefield rations demonstrates that survival is not only about abundance but about strategy, preparation, and the clever use of the resources nature provides. Every grain, every preserved morsel, every salted meal is a link in a chain of wisdom that stretches back thousands of years, connecting us to the generations who first recognized that a simple mineral could become one of the most important tools in the human arsenal against hunger and decay. Salt reminds us that survival depends not only on effort and skill, but on observation, creativity, and the ability to transform nature's gifts into enduring sustenance. It is a testament to the quiet, practical genius of our ancestors, and to the fact that sometimes the simplest substances, used wisely, can have the greatest impact on human life, health, and civilization. And so, as we close the story of ancient food hacks that quietly saved lives across centuries and continents, we can pause to appreciate the ingenuity, observation, and patience of those who came before us. The people who watched the world, experimented with what nature offered, and discovered clever ways to store, preserve, and transform simple ingredients into enduring sustenance. From the golden sweetness of honey to the humble durability of legumes, the energy-packed power of nuts and seeds, the transformative magic of fermentation, and the life-preserving magic of salt, each food hack was more than survival. It was a testament to human creativity and resilience, a quiet, patient genius that allowed civilizations to endure hunger, harsh climates, long journeys, and uncertain times. These ancient practices remind us that sometimes the simplest, most unassuming solutions can carry the greatest power, that observing the natural world and working with it patiently can safeguard life and sustain communities through hardship. And now, as your eyes grow heavy and the night wraps around you, let the stories of these timeless life-saving foods drift softly into your dreams, carrying you through the centuries across forests, deserts, mountains, and rivers with the knowledge that ingenuity and care have always been humanity's quietest companions. Good night, traveler, and may your journey through history and imagination bring warmth, curiosity, and rest, until the morning light awakens you once again.